Probably not many people playing WoW nowadays realize or remember that Warcraft used to produce tabletop RPGs as well. I mean, it makes sense. It's a massive fantasy franchise, and the D&D wasn't as big then as it is today. Among fans of fantasy games, it was still pretty big. So naturally, during the times of peak popularity of Warcraft, an RPG setting propped up. And it wasn't just some fan homebrew adaptation, not that there is anything wrong with them. So it wasn't a fan adaptation, it was an officially licensed product that showed us a lot of the lore that we wouldn't see otherwise for many years, or at all. A lot of the lore would never materialize for various reasons, sometimes because the developers of the actual World of Warcraft didn't like what came out, or didn't like the reaction people had to them. And let's dive in to these very particular RPGs, and yes, plural, because there were 2 of them in a very short succession, and then nothing. And if you can hear my fan in the background, my apologies, but it's hot in here, and I am not turning it off right now. So, my apologies in advance, but hopefully it will not be too disturbing for you. You see, the first RPG was dubbed the WarCraft the Roleplaying game, and it came out around the Warcraft 3 era, around 2004. And it is steeped in some of that pre-WoW flavor, and in many things that bring it much closer to D&D than that second iteration would. For instance, some of the main playable races in the original player's handbook, called just Warcraft the Role-Playing Game, were half-elves and half-orcs. Warcraft has otherwise been very stingy on mixed races, and we only ever see them in extremely rare circumstances. Until recently, the only named half-elves we have in the setting are children of the Windrunner sisters, so each seems to have fallen for a human, which seems like an interesting family trait, but anyway. Of course, we now have the whole Arathi Empire overseas, which had the races so mixed together they pretty much became one mixed race, and we didn't get them as a race in World of Warcraft. I think they did unlock the pointed ears for humans in the end, and that's how we got our half-elves in World of Warcraft. But no, in this book we had them as their own race, like they are, or they used to be until very recently in D&D. Until some designer of D&D said that the idea of mixed races disturbs him. Which, I hope that doesn't mean what I think it means, but it sounded very bad. Anyway, that was a digression, which I like to do sometimes. And this book takes a lot about half-elves from D&D. It mentions like how they are hated by both parent races and often misunderstood and disliked by both communities, both human and elven. And and I never understood that, either in D&D or in this system. I never understood where is that coming from. Why exactly are half-elves hated by humans? I never understood why half-elves being hated became such a big trope. I never understood that, and this game copies it very closely, and we never see that in World of Warcraft, or we just don't see the half-elves in World of Warcraft, really. The only ones that we now see are the Arathi, which is hardly ever addressed about who they are. This is where I had this whole rant about the character from the RPGs, the character of Finale Golden Sword and her human father, Dale in Proudmoore, and how he is exactly the kind of hypocrite that would have, and despite what Chris Metzen says, he is exactly the kind of hypocrite that would have a half-elf child and then go around saying racist things about elves. But also, this game also had half-orcs. I mean, how often do you see half-orcs in the setting? You see them even less than you'd see half-elves. By now, any half-orcs would be the oldest half-orcs would be in their 30s by now, so there's no timeline excuse anymore. so we could see more of them, but we are not seeing them. Basically, the only half orc we saw in the lore was Garona half orcan, or half orson, however you want to pronounce her last name. But she was basically the only half orc in the lore. Now and then they retconned her to be half Draenei. Then the movie came out, and in the movie she was half human again. And now Medivh, who in the original lore was apparently a father of her child, now in this timeline he's her father. So, like, what's going on there? Like, are you suggesting that there was something really weird going on between them in the original timeline? What was that about? That was a little bit weird. Like, I know they pretty much retconned Medan out of the timeline, but she was in a relationship with Medivh, kind of, and now in another timeline he's a father. So what's going on there? Anyway, but this is not about Garona. This is not about the Noah Golden Sword. This is about the things that this game does that are a lot more like D&D than they are like Warcraft. Let's just look at this. They have like, for races, they have Night Elves as a separate race, instead of just having just High Elves, and like having like a small reskin for Night Elves. Night Elves are their own race, but the other things that this game really does a lot more like D&D is like the class makeup. Like, if you go into the book and go into the actual manual, I will try to like paste screenshots of the manual, thanks to archive.org. I'll try to paste screenshots of it in here. You should be seeing them right now. You see that the class makeup of this RPG was a lot more like D&D than anything we would ever see from Warcraft later. Like, we had barbarians, where the warrior of World of Warcraft pretty much absorbed all the ideas and concepts of the barbarian. We have, as our primary arcane magic users, we have sorcerers and wizards. That is also something that I never liked in D&D. The whole distinction between sorcerers and wizards seems very gamey. Like, I know there is lore to it. There is a lore they added about it, how sorcerers have this innate magic and how they have this innate magical origin, and the wizards are learned magic users. But like in Warcraft, that has never really been a very strong distinction, where you had to have like a special magic gift. Pretty much anyone could just go up to Dalaran and learn to be a mage, and it calls them sorcerer and wizard. It calls the classes these D&D terms that are not really seen often in World of Warcraft or Warcraft in general. And you see, it adds another class, a new class that it calls healer. And that healer class is basically like a combination of multiple lore classes. Like it has like shaman and druid elements, and shaman and druid. What else was in there thrown into that? And a priest. Like, all these very disparate, very different classes were just thrown together into that healer class because they needed that idea that is somewhat unique-ish to the Warcraft lore represented somehow, but they smashed them all together in this healer class. Here's another class that shows up in this RPG, in the Warcraft, the role-playing game RPG, that is kind of unique to it, but also really shows its origin. And it's the Scout class. And back when I was originally playing these, when I was originally reading these, I didn't really understand the scout class. The way everything it was described about them, I thought just sounds like a hunter. Why didn't you just make a hunter class? And then you made hunter a prestige class. Like, what's that about? Why didn't you just make a hunter class? And you had to make this strange, like, kind of rogue, kind of hunter, this weird scout class. But having very limited experience with the actual D&D at the time, I didn't really realize that the scout was supposed to be a version of the ranger from D&D. But they couldn't call it the ranger because the elven ranger, based closer on WarCraft's idea of a ranger, was a prestige class. Why couldn't they just make that ranger the base class? I don't know, but that's what they decided to do. The ranger had to be the prestige class, and the scout had to be the renamed D&D ranger. It was another thing that shows you just how much D&D there was in this original system. And then you get to the prestige classes. And now the prestige classes, now that will show you a lot of the classes that you would later see either in the second system, either in the second RPG, or in World of Warcraft itself. And somehow the base classes from World of Warcraft are here represented as prestige classes. Now, if you're not familiar with the prestige classes, because you say you haven't played the old editions of D&D, prestige classes were like this very special kind of class that is ostensibly more powerful than your base class, where you can multi-class into that prestige class to get special perks, and those prestige classes would also have special requirements. Sometimes the requirements would be to have some base class or to have like some skills trained to a certain level. So sometimes you would need to plan your character ahead if you wanted to do a special prestige class. So you could, in this game, in the Warcraft, the role-playing game, you could say play a healer and then take a prestige class to become a druid of the wild, as they called it. They had to call it that to distinguish it from the actual druid from D&D 3rd edition. Because if you see at these pages that I should be showing you right now, if you see these pages, it will refer to the classes or skills or things that were seen first in the PHB, in the player's handbook of the 3rd edition of D&D. Because it wants you to have the basis of D&D 3rd edition, and without it, you can't really play, because it refers to a lot of those spells, those classes, and other systems. Another prestige class in this book is the Paladin Warrior. The Paladin Warrior, that's what they called it, because you had to be a warrior first. You didn't have to be a warrior, but you had to be something else first, and only then you could take up the prestige class to become a paladin. And they had to call it a Paladin Warrior because paladin was already a class in the base D&D. So you see just how much D&D there is on it. Like even Hunter is a prestige class in the system. Warlock and Necromancer are prestige classes in the system. In later books, they add like more prestige classes that are more like what you would imagine from a prestige class, something more like the hero classes of later ideas of hero classes. But here at the start, these base WoW classes are represented as prestige classes because they had to stick. They didn't have to, but they chose to stick to this original idea. to this original D&D system. Things would change with the second system. But you see, in these books, you see a lot of what, how much D&D there was in it. But you see, that's not even the most striking parts of this system. Like there were more books about it. I will get to the Manual of Monsters later, because first I wanted to talk about a book that was probably my favorite of all the RPG books back then. There was a book that they, for the first system, that they called Shadows and Light. And that book had a lot of the lore on the Titans, a lot of the lore on like Elune. They gave us stat blocks for the Titans and for Elune, so if you wanted to, you could go up and fight Elune or fight Aman'Thul. Of course, they were very over-leveled, even beyond epic levels of characters, because they were basically godlike characters. But even then, like the Titans, you have to remember that back then the Titans weren't supposed to be planets. So you weren't fighting a planet, you were fighting just a giant metal dude. Titans back then was supposed to be just a... I think it was in the RPG that they were first described as a race of metallic-skinned gigantic beings. And that's where, for many years, our idea of the Titans came from. We imagined them as a whole race of these giant guys that looked much like their constructs, the keepers and watchers on Azeroth. That's what we imagined the Titans to be like, just the most powerful of these guys. We imagined them as beings more like Thorim and Odin, just bigger and more powerful, the most powerful of their race. And that idea of them informed a lot of my early fan work on WarCraft. I have since adopted all the world soul changes, how the lore expanded on the whole world soul idea, and I didn't mind. I liked what the Chronicle did with them, because planets being associated with gods and gods being associated with planets has always been a thing in mythology, in real world mythology, so I accepted it, I embraced that change. But back then they were supposed to be just giant dudes, and you had stat blocks to fight them if your game went that way. And Shadows and Light gave us a lot of this background mythical lore into the setting. That was one of my favorite books back then. But one of the most problematic books at the time, was the Manual of Monsters. And on the surface, most of the book was fine. It was inoffensive. It was just, listings of various monsters from the Warcraft lore and stat blocks in 3rd edition D&D style, which allowed you to fight them with these characters, with these systems. But there was a thing at the end of the book that became very infamous, and it was the dreaded Appendix 3 of the Manual of Monsters. Why was the Appendix 3 so infamous? Why was it so famous, so known? Because it listed basically the ideas of various D&D monsters that didn't appear in the Warcraft setting, at least didn't appear yet, and there was ideas of how they could be adapted into Warcraft. And they were adapting stats, because you didn't need to adapt the stats. You were basically running 3rd edition D&D with campaigns, with a special campaign setting. So if you wanted to add a rust monster from D&D into your Warcraft game, you could simply grab the stat block from the 3rd edition D&D and just put it in your Warcraft game. So they didn't need to adapt the stats, but they listed their ideas of how these things fit into the Warcraft setting. But here's the thing, these books were supposed to be canon. Most of the information in these books at the time were said to be canon. At the time, Chris Metzen said that these books are about as canon as any published printed material for the Warcraft setting is. So you have these books that are supposed to be canon, that suddenly have an appendix that says that Ettins, before we've seen Ettins in Cataclysm, that Ettins are basically abominations created by necromancers by sewing two heads together on an abomination. It didn't call them abominations, but basically that was the idea. But if you copied the Ettins stat block, it wouldn't be actually be undead, so I don't know why they did that. They did that with a lot of monsters. A lot of monsters in the Appendix 3 were just described as, like a necromancer did it. Much like the likes to do, a wizard did it. Like, owlbears. Where do owlbears come from? I don't know, a wizard did it. Like, it could be just a natural creature. Like, a owlbear could be just a natural creature where, like, it's a type of monotreme. Like, look at the platypus and look at the owlbear. They're not that different in the basic morphology. So the owlbear could be just a monotreme. You didn't have to invent that the wizard did it. But that's what D&D likes to do, and the Appendix 3 of Manual of Monsters likes to say a necromancer did it. A necromancer sewed some monsters together and reanimated them, and now it's not undead for some reason. But you see, that book that was supposed to be canon now says that Ettins exist in Warcraft lore, which they didn't before. They exist in Warcraft lore, and then they were made by necromancers. And of course, most players actually playing it, whether they were or Warcraft players, World of Warcraft players were playing the game and looked at the books for cool information for their RP or something. Most players who would look at this appendix would naturally see, yeah, that's obviously bullshit. That's just an appendix used to so you can use those monsters in your game, in your TTRPG game. But there was technically no reason to dismiss these. These things were technically canon at the time. Of course, everyone knew that this was obviously nonsense. But the WoW wiki editors at the time couldn't just delete these paragraphs, couldn't just pretend they didn't exist. No, they had to be incorporated, and for a good time there was a lot of confusion between people who didn't know that much about the RPG and people who just thought they had to edit it into the WoW wiki. There was a lot of confusion about whether these things are canon. Blizzard would later come out and say it was one of the major reasons, besides characters like Finol Golden Sword, it was one of the major reasons why Blizzard would later come out and say, like, okay, these books are not necessarily canon anymore, because like we noticed these guys did some things that we didn't like, and we have to now we disown these books now. Of course, a lot of these ideas that were in the books, a lot of things that were in those books, not Manual of Monsters Appendix 3, but in general, like the descriptions they gave about the Titans back then, about Elune in Shadows and Light, these were supposed to be canon, because this wasn't just at White Wolf, I think that it wasn't just White Wolf designers' fan fiction. They wrote those books in cooperation with Blizzard. So they went to Blizzard, the designers went to Blizzard, and they said, okay, we want to make a book that shows people a lot of these cosmic background ideas. And like, what can you tell us about the Titans? And someone at Blizzard told them this about the Titans are this race of metallic skinned beings that travel the cosmos, ordering things around. So a lot of the books had these original Blizzard ideas that would only show up in World of Warcraft years later, or would never even show up, because these ideas came from Blizzard. Like there was a character that was also famous for like being kind of quasi-canonical because of these books, like character called Mogul Razdang, who was the leader of the venture company. And for many years, the only mentions of him would come from the RPG. But then the RPG was decanonized, so he was kind of deleted from the lore. But then, in BFA, I believe, there is a dungeon with Mogul Razdang, and he actually shows up in person. So you see that these ideas in those books, they were supposed, in grand majority of them, were supposed to be canon at the time of writing. And to this day, many people still treat some of those ideas as kind of quasi-canonical, even though officially they have been stricken from canon. Because these ideas, like I said, originally did come from Blizzard. And anyway, I have now been talking about this for nearly half an hour by now. So I will end it here, and I will return to the topic in an in-depth look at the second edition, the World of Warcraft, the role-playing game, which made a lot of changes to make it a lot more like the actual World of Warcraft game, and distanced itself in many ways from its D&D origin. And if you enjoyed my look at the original Warcraft, the role-playing game, I hope to see you next time in that one. I'll see you there.